Imagine that stopping Hitler from starting World War II would actually create a timeline far more horrifying than the one we know. You think preventing the deaths of 60 million people would be humanity's greatest triumph. But the truth is, your heroic intervention might doom our species to something infinitely worse. You're standing in Munich, November 1923. The beer hall putsch is about to fail, Hitler's about to be arrested, and you have the power to ensure he never rises again. One small push, one whispered warning to the authorities, one perfectly timed intervention, and the monster never becomes Germany's leader. Seems like the obvious choice, right? Save the world, prevent the Holocaust, stop the most devastating war in human history. Adolf Hitler became German Chancellor on January 30, 1933, setting in motion events that would reshape the world. But here's what you didn't consider. Hitler wasn't the cause of Germany's problems. He was the symptom. And symptoms can be replaced by something far more competent and terrifying. Let's dive into the immediate consequences of your well-intentioned time travel. With Hitler gone from the political scene, Germany's economic collapse continues unabated. The hyperinflation, the crushing war reparations from Versailles, the national humiliation, none of that disappears. You've removed one failed politician and mediocre strategist, but you haven't addressed any of the underlying conditions that made millions of Germans desperate for radical change. Without Hitler's bombastic speeches and theatrical politics, the Nazi movement fragments. But here's where things get interesting. Other far-right groups don't just disappear. They adapt. They learn from the Nazis' mistakes. Instead of crude beer hall revolts, you get sophisticated political maneuvering. Instead of a ranting Austrian corporal, you get competent military officers and brilliant political minds taking control. The most terrifying possibility? Someone like General Erich von Falkenhayn or a coalition of Prussian military elites seizes power instead. These aren't amateur revolutionaries stumbling toward totalitarianism. These are professionals who understand logistics, strategy, and governance. They wouldn't make Hitler's catastrophic errors. Declaring war on America, opening a two-front war, or micromanaging military operations from a bunker. But let's say somehow, miraculously, Germany stabilizes into a democracy. You're feeling pretty good about yourself, right? You've saved the world. Except now we need to talk about what happens to the Soviet Union. Without the imminent Nazi threat, Stalin's paranoid purges of the military accelerate. Hitler's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, triggered the European phase of World War II. But without that catalyst, Stalin has no external pressure forcing him to modernize his military. Instead, he turns his attention westward much earlier. With Germany weak and fractured, and Britain focused on its crumbling empire, Stalin sees an opportunity. The Red Army, unpurged and battle-tested from ongoing conflicts with Japan in the east, begins expanding into Eastern Europe not as a response to Nazi aggression, but as the primary aggressor. Poland falls anyway, but this time to the Soviets alone. Then Romania, then Finland. Where does it stop? Here's what keeps historians awake at night. A Soviet Europe with no Nazi Germany to exhaust their resources. Stalin wasn't content with Eastern Europe. His ultimate goal was global communist revolution. Without the devastating war against Germany, the USSR emerges from the 1940s as an unchallenged continental superpower with nuclear ambitions and an intact military-industrial complex. Now consider the ripple effects across the globe. Without World War II, Japan never attacks Pearl Harbor. They're too busy conquering China and Southeast Asia, unopposed by a distracted West. The Japanese empire stabilizes across the Pacific, creating a three-way Cold War between Soviet Europe, Imperial Japan, and an increasingly isolated America and Britain. But here's the most disturbing possibility. The Holocaust happens anyway, just differently. Anti-Semitism didn't begin with Hitler. It was endemic across Eastern Europe. Without the systematic, industrial approach of Nazi Germany that ultimately shocked the world into action, you get centuries more of pogroms, expulsions, and scattered massacres across multiple countries. The death toll might actually be higher, spread across decades instead of years, with no Nuremberg trials to establish international law against genocide. The technological implications are equally chilling. Germany's rocket program, led by Werner von Braun, still develops under different leadership. But instead of ultimately defecting to America, German rocket technology stays in Europe. Meanwhile, without the urgency of World War II, the Manhattan Project never happens. The first nuclear weapons are developed by either Soviet scientists or a still powerful German state, giving them a decades-long head start in the atomic age. Think about the philosophical implications. World War II, despite its horrors, created the modern international system. The United Nations, NATO, the Geneva Conventions, Universal Human Rights Declarations. These institutions emerged directly from humanity's revulsion at Nazi crimes. Remove that catalyst, and you're left with the same old balance of power politics that produced World War I. Nothing fundamental changes about how nations interact, meaning another global conflict becomes inevitable. Without the unifying threat of fascism, the Western democracies never develop their post-war cooperation. America remains isolationist longer. Britain focuses on maintaining its empire rather than building transatlantic partnerships. France and Germany continue their centuries-old rivalry without ever learning to work together. The European Union never forms, NATO never exists, and collective security remains a pipe dream. Here's where it gets truly terrifying. The delayed war that eventually comes is fought with 1950s or 1960s technology instead of 1940s weapons. Imagine World War II fought with early nuclear weapons, jet aircraft, and guided missiles, but with the same nationalism and imperial ambitions that caused the First War. The casualties wouldn't be 60 million. They'd be in the hundreds of millions. Consider also what we lose scientifically. Many of World War II's technological advances, from radar to computers to rocket technology, were developed under wartime pressure. Without that urgency, technological progress slows dramatically. The space race never happens because there's no competition between superpowers. Medical advances that came from treating war injuries are delayed by decades. Even the internet might never be invented, as it originated from military communication needs. The moral complexity becomes overwhelming when you realize that stopping Hitler doesn't stop fascism. It potentially makes it more effective. Competent fascists are infinitely more dangerous than incompetent ones. A Germany led by skilled generals and clever politicians, rather than a ranting madman, might actually succeed in creating their 1,000-year empire. They'd be smart enough to avoid Hitler's mistakes while pursuing the same horrific goals. So here's the ultimate question that should haunt every time traveler. Is it better to have a monster whose incompetence limits his evil, or to create space for a more competent monster to take his place? Your attempt to save the world might not prevent the darkness. It might just ensure that when it comes, it's led by someone who actually knows what they're doing. The terrifying truth is that stopping Hitler from starting World War II doesn't create a better world. It potentially creates a world where evil succeeds because it's no longer limited by one man's flaws. Sometimes the monster you know is preferable to the monster you create by trying to play God with history. What if the real lesson here isn't about changing the past, but about understanding how the present we live in, despite its horrors, might actually be the best possible outcome of an impossibly complex chain of events? Would you still make that intervention knowing what you know now? Let me know in the comments what you think happens when we try to fix history's greatest tragedy.